Jaha, I know we talked last time that it was the end of August, but now, as it is the start of September, it is September 3rd. That means you're leaving to Mexico tomorrow
I am
on
indeed.
the
I
4th.
am indeed flying. I am indeed taking a midnight flight that leaves at 11:55 from Chicago to Mexico.
Well, that's really exciting, because I know that COVID hasn't been great across the country with the Delta variant, but it's at least encouraging to see more travel happening, and obviously you are traveling, which is encouraging.
Yeah, it's very exciting if you love international red eye flights that take off at midnight and land at 4 a.m.
And I hear also that you may have an opportunity to go to Wales, I believe, later in the month, which sounded super interesting, um, to me at least.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's still tentative, but it's called the Talyllyn Railway. Of course, butchered name because it's a Welsh name, but it is the oldest um, preserved steam railway in the world, um, and of course it's still running and is runs based on volunteers. So I may or may not have a chance to volunteer there, which should be super exciting, especially since first of all it's a railway, second of all it's in rural Wales, and third of all it's steam. Like how cool is that?
Yeah, that's awesome. And so where in Wales is this train, and how do you plan to get
It's
there?
the it's the it's in the city of and you'll have to help me out because I am not familiar with Welsh at all, but it's
And nor am I.
Tywyn, right? So I one would presume it's pronounced like if it were in the U.S. it would be pronounced Tywin, but I presume it's pronounced like Tywin or Tywin.
I legitimately have no idea, so that would be my best
Right,
guess.
but it's basically in like central western Wales by the sea, and it's also where the mountains are, for example. Um, how to get there? That is a good question. The closest international airport is obviously Birmingham in the UK, but surprisingly, flights from Cincinnati, if you fly direct to some other European cities, is actually much cheaper. For example, flying to Helsinki or Barcelona, you can save at least $100 on airfare at least. Um,
Wow, that's a very good deal.
so maybe, but then again, of course, you have to consider flying from those other cities to the UK and then all the train tickets that are involved. Um, so yeah, it's something to figure out, I suppose.
But it sounds very busy with a trip to Mexico, then possibly a trip to Wales, and then later trips to Asia next year, and maybe a trip to Quebec later in the year. So a lot of travel it seems lined up,
We
which is
shall
which is
see.
good.
We shall see. Yeah, but I mean, how have you been? I know school has started. How's that been going along?
So school has started, and it's actually a bit enjoyable for some reason because I found myself just being enjoying the sense of being occupied because I've had a lot of both schoolwork to do, college app work to do. I have to get some answers done for a questionnaire for my letter of recommendations. So it's been busy, but it's been enjoyable in a sense because I haven't really been forced into a position where I'm like just choosing to do not productive things because I have a lot of things to do. It's a good feeling.
Mm. What's the what's the most and the least enjoyable class that you're taking?
That's a good question. In terms of enjoyability, I've been really enjoying urban studies just because the content itself is super interesting.
Wait, wait,
But
hold on, hold
like,
on. Urban studies?
yeah, it's actually a new class. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but it is a new class offered this year. And the teacher has a really cool backstory. She was originally, I believe, a public policy fellow, and then she worked in a lower level position at the Obama White House. But then she managed to get her way into teaching, and so now she teaches history courses at my school, and she's really into urban studies, and she's been pitching the course for a couple of years, but they finally let her offer it this year.
That's. I mean, you just casually dropped it. You just like casually dropped. Oh yeah, she worked at a low level job in the Obama administration, the Obama White House.
I don't actually. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know which one it is, but I believe she was some public policy figure there. But yeah, anyway, urban studies has been really enjoyable, and I've linear algebra has been really great in the sense that I expected it to be pretty bad, but it's been not as stressful as I thought, and actually pretty interesting and maybe applicable to the real world.
But well, it seems like you're taking a ton of fancy classes, huh? Like, I mean, certainly at my school, and I'm sure most schools, urban studies is not a choice.
To be honest, I don't really know because I haven't been engaged in a public school curriculum, so I don't really know what's offered. I mean, I know that I'm not taking AP classes, which used to actually be a drawback for college apps because some schools, especially Georgetown, just didn't really think that the school was rigorous enough. I think that is kind of that paradigm is changing over time. But our school is a bit different, clearly, in the way that classes are offered and marketed.
It certainly seems like if you guys are being taught by Obama administration public policy people or
Mhm.
whatever you said.
Mhm. And yeah, the teacher background is very expansive and wide. Some of the teachers are older and have PhDs and did a lot of academic work in their field, but then decided they wanted to come to teaching. So then they teach at the school, and then some teachers are just out of college and super interested in the subject and want to get into teaching and experience what that's like. So it's nice the wide variety. And also, you did ask about my least enjoyable class, which is probably um
You're taking Japanese,
probably
right? Is that enjoyable? Is that your
it's enjoyable.
least enjoyable?
It's definitely not the least because I've had the same teacher for 3 years now, and I really like him, and he's great. Um, I mean, hopefully none of the teachers that are listening to this feel offended, but I haven't, I guess, enjoyed the content as much of multivariable calculus. I think the class is great, the teacher is great, but the content is like I don't see how it's going to be relevant. I think we're doing
Yeah.
uh, parametrization, parametric curves right now, which is in a sense it's fun to at least do the problem solving part, but I don't see how it's useful.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I took multivariable calculus, which was one of which was a big mistake for me because it wasn't relevant to my what I want to do at all. Because I'm certainly a much more humanities, international relations, that sort of kiddo. Multivariable calculus I found out was like a pure engineering class. Um, so I mean I don't know how has the content gotten like super hard yet?
Not yet. Well, we've only had class for a week,
Mm.
so I would think we have a problem set coming up for next week that I'll have to look at, but I think it's similar content. And it's not. I don't really feel like I'm gonna struggle in the class because there's a ton of support mechanisms, and I can meet with the teacher and meet with students. So it's not like it's gonna be hard to do well in the class, but the content itself may just be annoying.
Yeah. I mean, when I took it, at online at a college, the University of Cincinnati. So it was online. The teacher was not a very good professor. It was only, lecture recordings. So I guess that probably played into, why I hated the class. Um,
Well, I was gonna say, since you took it, I was thinking maybe our school wasn't all that different if you had taken it in high school. But I don't know if most high schools offer it or not. I really don't. I'm not familiar with high school
nah,
curriculums.
most high schools don't offer multivariable calculus. Certainly, certainly, it's certainly especially for the majority of high schools, which aren't exactly super academically advanced, I should say. Yeah, no, there's still plenty of people who are taking for example, algebra 2 and pre-calculus in their junior and senior years.
Hmm. And I don't even know if like the school itself is. I think more. It's they're listening to what students want, and a lot of the courses are more just like student demand based and what the teachers want to teach about. And interestingly, this year, since we're on like an adapted COVID schedule where we're only doing 4 days of schooling a week, essentially,
Hmm.
we now have like a workshop block starting on some Wednesdays where teachers can teach about anything they want with no grades and just like seminar style classes, or students can lead them too. So that's actually really exciting too.
Wait, that's that's super cool. Wait, like what? Like for example, what can you teach?
It can be on anything really. I think it just has to be academic.
Can it can like theoretically could like I go and like teach a class about the implications of of snails and boats in central
Yeah,
eastern
you
South
totally could. I
Bolivia.
mean, you would have to be a student because right now we're a closed campus and not open to visitors. But
Ah,
yeah, you would be able to.
well, there goes my ambitions of teaching a class about snails and boats and what did I say?
In Bolivia.
South. It was like southeastern, central eastern, South Bolivia. I don't know. Are you? I mean, are you going to teach a course?
I'm not sure what the process is yet. For some, they made us brainstorm ideas of things we could teach. So I would be interested in. So I'm applying to Yale, and one of the questions for Yale was if you had to teach a course, what would it be on? And my answer was something along the lines of like or like how to build a successful airline in the oceanic region. So that would be interesting to teach
Oh,
about.
hey, that seems familiar.
Yeah, viewers will remember our episode on that. And I also, what could be even more interesting, at least for a longer seminar style class, would be just doing discussions of different public transit systems and reviewing how they were designed and reviewing their histories, which is kind of what we're doing in our urban studies class later on in the year. But that would be really cool to do in a less
Actually,
formal setting.
since you brought up the Yale application, could I ask you like, is there also still the question about like if you could invite someone to speak, who would you invite?
Yeah, that still exists. Did you answer? Have you applied and did you
I
answer that?
did. I applied last year. I mean, I got rejected, but I had. Well, first of all, what are you gonna put? Because I had the perfect answer that I thought.
Well, right now I was thinking I would invite shoot, I'm forgetting his first name, but it was the Mayor Peñalosa of it was Enrique Peñalosa, the mayor of Bogota, from I think 2000 to 2006 or something like that.
Why? What question would you ask him?
Well, I'm particularly intrigued because so he was the guy, he was essentially the brain behind the Transmilenio bus rapid transit system in Bogota, which, in terms of a bus system being implemented by one guy, essentially was, I mean, it's unprecedented. So I was just really intrigued by how he got the system to be so successful. And I'm fascinated by like how a major bus system could even be possible in a city like Bogota. So that was really interesting to me.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I guess that is a very that's certainly very certainly showcases your interest in transit. If all the other stuff didn't already.
But you said you had a perfect answer. So what were you thinking for
Okay,
that?
well here, first of all, the prompt is, if you could invite anybody, living or dead, fictional or non-fictional, to come and, speak, who would you invite? And then also, what question would you ask that individual, right? So mine, so for my answer, I had the perfect one. I would have invited the captain of Malaysian Airlines 370. I forgot his name. It was like some Malaysian name. And the question I would have asked was, "Where were you?" Which I just thought was perfect, but I guess Yale University did not think so.
I mean, it would have been nice if you could get feedback on what parts of the application they liked, but I'm sure they would love that answer.
Isn't it perfect? Isn't it perfect? I don't know.
I mean, it shows off your interest. It shows off, I guess, your passion that you really care about, like unearthing the details of the flight, and it answers the prompt perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, it also, it's quirky, eh? Like, you know, it's a short, sweet question, but alas, you know, Yale University. I did get, I got the response from Yale University was, oh, um, you know, we're very sorry, blah 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 blah, blah, right? This year was one of the most competitive, right? All the rest.
Yeah, all the stuff that's supposed to make you feel better about not getting
Mm-mm.
accepted.
Yeah, exactly. Not at all.
But anyway, spoiler alert: this episode was not on teaching courses and on applications. We had intended actually to talk about more recent news in light of the Senate bill, which is currently sitting in the middle of nowhere, attempting to be passed in the House on improving and spending, I believe, just over $1 billion on public transit and on infrastructure and projects like that. And so the funding actually is not all completely new. It's only 550 billion in new spending. But we had hoped that we could break down what the bill is about, particularly looking at the transit side of it, because of course not all of it is based on transit, but a lot is. So we had hoped that we could provide an overview for that context, because if everything goes to plan, it should be passed in September, and that would obviously mark a major landmark legislation for almost all forms of transit.
Yeah, Jack. So why don't you like, if you could you like give a brief overview about like what the bill is and then like its progress so far? Because like, I that's of course important to cover first of all, but there's I and lots of people, we have a lot of opinions on it, and
Mhm.
for sure, yeah.
Yeah, so this bill is originally based off of Joe Biden's American Jobs Plan, which it ended up being at least fairly different from what he intended, because it cut down a lot of the spending. And so now the new bill, I don't actually remember what it's called, but it is focused heavily on like generic general infrastructure. And so specifically on the elements we're interested in, it spends 100 billion in new spending for roads and bridges, um, and I believe it adds a bit more just to general highway and road projects in relation to that. Uh, it also spends 39 billion on public transit and 60, I believe, 66 billion on rail. Uh, and then it also has 25 billion for aviation, and some of that is going to controlling increases and making air traffic controlling better. So those are really the key aspects we're interested in, uh, especially the road funding, the aviation funding, and the train funding. So a lot of it actually is going to a lot of the infrastructure we would normally think of, like the vehicles that move us around, those kind of stuff, is getting a lot of funding from this. But like you mentioned, there is a lot of disputing over how much funding should be allocated, and where it should be.
I mean, yeah. So like Jack said, right? The main aspects of it are, there's the main components, right? Funding for roads and bridges, funding for transit and rail development, funding for broadband and internet, funding for what we consider bulk infrastructure like airports and um, you know airports, seaports, um, and then also after that, there's the electric and the water systems, which also receive funding. And then finally, number six is probably, there's also, for example, environmental relief, right? Um, Effectively to help clean up certain mine and gas sites. But this, as you said, it's past the Senate, so now it's effectively, it needs to be passed by the House. Um, but first of all, I guess we should talk about this because it is partially a reason why it is being caught up. Jack, what do you think about this bill? Just plain out. Do you think it's
The bill does not cover enough of what needs to be covered. So I imagine we'll talk about it more later, but there's a lot of funding. Like, obviously, our infrastructure is terrible in the U.S., and I think it has a D grade from like most agencies that certify it.
mm-hmm.
And to fix it, it would require probably way over $1 trillion for all roads, for all public transit, and for all rail systems that both want to be extended, expanded, built new altogether, or repaired. And yeah, like it's important to note. So there's just for an example, the West Seattle Bridge in Seattle is undergoing a major repair project because there were cracks in it, and that bridge alone, just to repair, is $520 million around. So like if you want to add up all of the bridges that both need to be built or repaired, that would be way over the 100 billion that's allocated for, and that's also for highways too. And this is just a bridge. So like that alone, we need way more funding in a bill to actually have good infrastructure improvements. And also, clearly, as we'll mention later, the discrepancy between highway funding and train funding and public transit funding is huge. Well, so will likely, I mean, yes, there are money going to try to get people to get electric cars and to ride and to be more conscious about emissions, but likely we'll see that car usage just goes up because public transit is not going to be as well funded. So I think there's a lot of backlash from certain groups saying that the climate issues with the bill are bad,
Well,
and a lot of that is from yeah.
well,
Go
let me
ahead.
ask you this, right? Because you did mention, for example, because you did say that we need a lot more, much more than what is currently needed, right? But one argument that some people would make is that at least this represents some sort of effort to plug money into a badly needed bill. Like the alternative is to have nothing, right? Um, what do you think of that statement, that argument?
I'm generally supportive that we need funding, all the funding we can get, and clearly right now, with the Democrats holding both the House and the Senate, this is probably going to be the only time, probably maybe even this entire decade, that we'll have a chance to pass a bill like this. Because I mean, when Republicans had control of Congress, and sorry that this is becoming a very political discussion, they didn't really do much on infrastructure. So I feel like if we're going to pass something, we
Well,
should
I
pass it
mean,
now, and it
that's
may not be great,
that. I
but
mean,
like
that's just how politics works, right? Like each president, because their approval rating naturally goes down. They only pass like one big landmark thing, right? Like Obama passed, um, Obamacare, didn't really do much after. Trump passes big tax cuts, didn't do much after. This may be Biden's like only thing, unless he
mhm, mhm.
manages, to keep both houses of Congress in
And
2022.
he had the American Rescue Plan too, the COVID bill. Um, I mean,
Well,
it
I
is
mean, I
surprising
guess I
that
guess that's probably an outlier, but
yeah, but like my concern is that well, yes, it's gonna be great to have all this funding, but like when Obama was president, he put a lot of effort into the ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or the Reinvestment and Recovery, which was meant to get us out of the Great Recession, but it was like $900 billion, which was every economist was saying that's way too little and way too small. And then ultimately, it led to the economy not building back as much as people expected because there wasn't enough stimulus, and that led to a lot of political realignment and whatnot throughout the first half of that decade. So my concern, at least, would be that if we pass this bill, while it might have some short-term improvements across all sectors, it's not going to be as great as what people want, especially Democrats. And then if they don't see improvements, they're just going to vote out the people who voted for it. So it's not going to really have a good political effect
well,
either.
that's another thing because like even though the kind of changes that are needed, right? As you mentioned, they would require much more money. The goals that they have, of what this bill will become are super grandiose, right? Like if you recall back, when we talked about the new proposed Amtrak rail network, that was uber ambitious, right?
Yeah,
Calling
absolutely.
for enhanced services on so many new corridors, um, like a ton of new routes. Even on existing routes, they're gonna like double or triple the service. That as we sort of kind of agreed on in that episode, those goals were not realistic like at all. Um, so you see the rest of this infrastructure bill, and like my own personal opinion is like I kind of laugh at it just because they seem to be, I don't know, in my opinion it seems to be sort of in the middle, right, where they set the goal too high to the point where they set the goal much too high to the point where um, it will inevitably come short of that of that goal. But you know, as you said, right, if we want to have you know change that is needed, it's going to require much more money than what they are allotting.
Hmm. Well, and the Amtrak point is interesting because I have it here. So the bill is spending 66 billion in new funding for rail, and it appears that the way it was drawn up by the senators who maybe have geographical influence, but they wanted to spend most of that on the Northeast Corridor and boosting that service, which is probably good because I think a lot of the goals are to increase the track speed of the existing Acela and to improve that corridor, which is probably great because that's good for Amtrak and it's good for their profit and it's good for that corridor. But they're also getting 16 billion to support long distance routes and another 12 billion for jump-starting high-speed rail, which that piece is interesting to me because at least I hadn't realized that Amtrak was the one spearheading high-speed rail because most of it was more, I guess, private industry based with like the Bright Line and the Texas Central. So, I mean, comparatively, that's a lot of money for Amtrak, who really has not got that much funding. But of course, there's other sectors of this bill that, especially the public transit side, that maybe are underfunded.
Well, I mean, the point about how Amtrak, them plugging money into for Amtrak to develop high speed rail, that certain I think that certainly represents an effort in to keep Amtrak competitive in the realm of high speed rail, especially since all those other private companies, are developing rail on their own, high speed rail on their own.
Mhm. And frankly, private companies probably are gonna do a better job of at least initiating these projects and getting them done because it seems like it takes Amtrak forever to get projects started and actually finished, uh, and especially with higher speed tracks and whatnot. But I think it's good, especially because it uses the terminology jumpstart, which would presumably mean it's not just going towards the Acela and making that project better. So I mean, maybe we'll see more Amtrak branded high speed rail, which I think would be great.
Maybe, hopefully. I mean, again, this map, their ambitions are certainly much too high. But another thing that's important to consider is that um, Biden has unveiled this as a sort of what was it, 8-year plan, right? I believe that's yeah,
I think that sounds
yeah,
it sounds
that is the time frame, an 8-year plan, right? That is first of all, that is presuming that he wins again, right? That is presuming that the Republicans don't come back, that they don't lose the presidency in 2024. But even still, right? Would you say that all of this, all the things they're hoping to achieve, not just in terms of rail, but also in the roads and bridges, which is one could say is easily um, as big a task? Do you think that's realistic within this time frame?
I think it can be. Well, it's hard to judge because for so long we really haven't had any infrastructure spending. But when we've had the funding and actually invest enough money into it without because in a lot of ways projects get delayed because they don't have enough funding to begin with. So if we give projects adequate funding, I think we can see big improvements over time. We spent a lot of money, federal money, on public transit projects in the 70s, and we saw a lot of growth in the MARTA system and the DC Metro, which were built up really quickly because of federal funding. And I think if we can do that again, both with infrastructure like actual roads and whatnot, and then also public transit, that might be effective if we have adequate funding.
I mean, yeah, that certainly makes sense, especially the point about the DC Metro, where if time and effort, where if enough money and effort were put into it, you can get it done real quick, and then as soon as that leaves, you can see how the DC Metro is now, right? They started their extension, the Silver Line, to Dulles Airport, like what, 10 years ago, and it's still not done. So and that's only like what, a small short stretch. Like there's only like what, gonna be 2 or 3 stations on that tiny stretch.
Exactly. Yeah.
But alas, which but that also raises the question, right? If there is enough will to getting it done, right? Even in Congress, if there's enough will to get it done, would it be realistic in the context of everything else that's going on, namely, coronavirus, which is still, taking a heavy toll?
I don't see why it can't be, and it's interesting because COVID has delayed a lot of things, but it's also sped up construction on a lot of projects. In some ways, I mean, in some, it's delayed some material shipments, which at least, for some projects, I know more locally, Caltrain electrification here was delayed because of COVID because we couldn't get things shipped fast enough. but it's also sped up some projects where since ridership is down, at least a lot of transit agencies could get away with more daytime construction because they weren't running as much services, so it wouldn't have as much of an impact. So it probably is really dependent actually on the region and the ridership level. But if we can get a lot of the public transit and rail done quickly, even during COVID, that's going to be huge in establishing a path forward once COVID is actually fully over and getting people back onto these systems.
I mean, I guess that is one way to think about it, but I mean, my biggest, you know, thought process of this whole bill in the context of coronavirus is that, well, on the surface, at least, right, it would seem sort of, um, I guess there's sort of like how do you describe it? It's sort of a contradictory message in that, oh, stay home because of COVID, but also we're building new rail lines, new connections everywhere, which I guess is sort of funny. Um, but for example, one of the big sources of funding for the major infrastructure bill, that the bill has proposed is that certain unrelief um, COVID funds, unused COVID relief funds, would be used to pay for the all the things that are going to be included in this bill, and that would include certain states terminating pandemic unemployment benefits early. What that would basically presuppose is that the worst of COVID is over, right? As a lot of us have been, but as we all know, the Delta variant and whatever else comes next, um, there's no guarantee on that. So
Hmm.
one of the things that I suppose I thought of is that what if we go ahead with the infrastructure bill, right, and then boom, the next another worse shutdowns akin to what happened in March 2020 happened, right? Then all that everything would just come grinding to a halt effectively. Um,
Exactly, and with all these mutating variants, like that's a very like that could happen if we don't have vaccines that are resistant to those variants. But also that also just calls into question like why are we using COVID relief funds in the first place? And that really is more of a political debate as to whether we should be like how we should be taxing it or funding it. And I know like a lot of it is driven by Republicans not wanting to raise taxes on anybody, including the wealthy, or or yeah, like any I guess fiscal policy like that they think is going to harm middle class citizens. Although of course Biden said he was never going to raise taxes on anyone who makes less than 400,000. So I think it's a bummer. It's gonna funding's not gonna end up that way, but I mean at least it's possible, and at least we don't have to like borrow more money or whatever.
I mean, yeah. Well, that's that's one of the constant debates, right? How do you pay for this? One of the options is certainly to go further into debt, as if the debt weren't already huge enough. So Congress is really getting sort of creative in finding that sort of spare money lying around. But that just raises more political questions in an already politically tense environment, which actually I want to sort of talk about now because by and the bill is being described as bipartisan, but it is in no way a grand, harmonious, unanimous, uniting piece of legislation in Congress, right? I believe that the Senate vote was 69-30, if I'm
That sounds right.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think 99 senators voted.
Right, 69-30, which means that 19 Republicans flipped the aisle and 30 voted against. So it is a very politically, it is still fairly politically divisive. Not to the point of 50-50, but especially, in the context of infrastructure, and in what the infrastructure bill is going to allot. Because as we all know, right? Not all, like as we all know, the bill contains major allotments for developing high speed rail, for example, or uh, increasing increasing Amtrak service, right? major parts of the country, either don't have that or even aren't fit for that, right? Where highways and roads and
Right.
auto traffic is, predominant. I believe, lots of people were saying, right, quote, this, we are a highway state. Lots of, you know, politicians in
Mhm.
rural America. So, I would say that is that's probably another major thing we have to consider in terms of feasibility. Um,
Mhm.
you know,
Well,
yeah.
I'm honestly surprised that it didn't get more Republican votes because if you look at the funding, it still feels like the Republicans got their way because they got a lot of funding for highways, which Democrats didn't want to spend as much on. They cut down the public transit spending by I think 10 billion. They cut down the rail spending. They cut down on the credits for electric vehicles. They cut down on everything because they have these like fiscal concerns, and we can debate whether they're founded or not at a later date. But like they got a lot of what they wanted out of this bill, and still to see 30 of them not vote for it is interesting because I feel like a lot of these concerns that they like Republicans campaign on fixing infrastructure and fixing a lot of issues that they can do in this bill, and I mean it still feels like a very conservative bill to me in the way that it's written, which isn't a bad thing. Like it accomplishes a great deal of things, but like I'm surprised about the political state of it.
I mean, well, I to it. Well, I mean, part of that's inevitable because if you're if you're representing hardcore, red state, Trump supporting populists, right? You will vote no just to show that you're not, being indoctrinated by Biden, right? Or you'll vote no just to say, oh no, you know, we don't believe the same things as the filthy Democrats. So I guess some of that's honestly inevitable just because of the nature of politics. Um, but I would say, another thing to consider is that, um, especially for a lot of those other, for a lot of other, more rural voters, right? Um, just the entire concept of having more government involvement, even if it's for infrastructure, is still a really big no no. Um,
Right.
especially
Yeah.
especially when the government is especially when, for example, a democratic government believes so many other things, right? A democratic federal government believes so many other things which the much of conservative America is opposed to. No, even if what is good, I'm sorry, even if what is included in the bill is good for most of the nation, just because it's not being led, just because it's not being led by Republicans, right? And the credit will ultimately go to the Democrats. May just be something that a lot of people are opposed to, right? It's like
Mhm.
it's like this.
Well, that's
It's like the sort of, I'd rather go down dying than let you win sort of mindset.
well, yeah. The question of big government is interesting because I've read more books about it recently, and I've heard that actually there's actually like a wide disparity of views among rural Americans that both want more uh less government influence, but they're really more concerned about like they're ultimately conservative because of the social values, but economically, like if they can have their roads fixed and have a better access to hospitals or better access to broadband, like those are all huge things that aren't really, I guess, big government influence. It's more just like I guess fixing the things they already come to expect in life, and it's not like their values are being intruded upon or whatnot. I mean, maybe a high speed rail line would cut through someone's farm, which I know would have opposition to, and maybe rightly so. But like in terms of the actual involvement of the government, I mean, it's not like I don't know like what the concerns of rural residents would be, and I would expect almost all rural residents would be supportive of this. I mean, the polls themselves show like I think when I looked recently, it was like 3 in 4 Americans or something like that support this bill, like something really high like that. So I mean, in terms of its in like actual support among non-politicians, I think it's still fairly high.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, much of for example, Republican politicians, right? They have to carefully be carefully strategic. Look at how how voting for this bill will affect their own political careers, right? Because in the future, for Republican politicians, this may be a point of attack. It's like, oh, well, it's like, if another Republican runs against them, it's like, oh, well, you voted for the Dirty Democrats bill or whatever, right? Um, and so, you're not a real Republican. You're not staying true to Republican values, which of course is not a healthy sentiment, a healthy mindset to have in any case, no matter what the situation is. But unfortunately, that is the reality that we live in. Um,
And maybe the 19 Republicans that did vote for it just think this bill is gonna be terrible for the Democrats politically, which it might be because it's gonna be pretty bad, like we
well,
talked
that's,
about. So maybe
I mean,
they're
yeah,
willing to support it because they know it's gonna harm the Democrats eventually.
yeah, that's basically one of the two predominant reasons for why those Republicans have voted. It's either that number one, what you said, in that it would be detrimental to Democrats, which would be popular among Republicans, or number two, um, they legitimately think the bill is good, and that the benefits of voting for the bill outweigh any negative consequences they would have, in for their own support. For example, Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, right? Steadfast Republican. But he is also retiring this year. He will not be running again next election cycle. So he does not need to take in his future political career at all. And probably legitimately believes that this bill will
It's
accomplish,
good,
yeah,
yeah.
will accomplish a lot of things. But certainly for the younger Republican politicians, it may be a much more sticky situation.
To put it lightly, I mean, we have so many new uh, senators like the Josh Hawley type or the Cynthia Lummis type. I mean, they've got a long road ahead of them that they'll have to deal with. But I mean, just realistically, this bill can't really backfire on Republicans because they're getting what they're wanting. They're gonna rural Americans will probably be stoked to get broadband, and infrastructure is going to improve, and more people will be able to drive, and I guess that's what Republicans want. Um, but I guess on the topic of politics, it's interesting to see what's been occurring since the bill has been passed in the Senate because now it's up to the House, but I believe Pelosi has said she's not going to do anything with it until the Senate passes the larger 3.5 trillion, the budget reconstruction or whatever it is,
Right.
bill, which now is in jeopardy because Joe Manchin has said that he thinks it's stupid to spend $3.5 trillion,
Right.
because it's going to cause inflation and it's going to be wasteful spending and it's going to cause more debt,
There's that. There's
and I
that
guess it'll crash the U.S. economy.
economically conservative for you.
And that could derail this entire process, and no pun intended, but literally we might lose out on all of this infrastructure spending if Joe Manchin holds out on this I guess social infrastructure bill.
Well, I mean, it's not. It's not just Joe Manchin. It's also Kirsten Sinema of Arizona. Who they said they would oppose the bill until the price tag, right, was cut down. But now it's I believe this was just yesterday, where Joe Manchin said that he thinks there should be a strategic pause, quote, right, strategic pause in moving forward with the plan. Basically meaning 3.5 trillion bucks is too much. Um, which, I mean, I think this is it's certainly in character for Joe Manchin. It's certainly something
Right.
that pisses the Democrats off. Um, but I
We'll,
yeah.
we'll talk about strategy. I mean, there's elections coming up in a year, so if Democrats want to win, they probably want to pass some big policies,
Yeah.
and and Democrats aren't going to win anything if they don't pass this bill.
Yeah, I mean it's funny. It has legitimately almost been a year and nothing too significant has happened. Like,
Yeah, but because besides the COVID bill, like that's
uh
not gonna have a lasting impact on people. I mean,
right.
I don't know. I'm maybe blindsided a bit because I live in a bubble, but like I don't know if most voters are gonna remember that they got benefits for a couple months, almost a year and a half before an election.
Hmm. Well, yeah, yeah. It's I mean, it would be imperative for both sides. For the Democrats, you know, if the bill were passed, it would be imperative um, for you know to showcase that you know they've done something, right? You know, we are, you know, our party now is one that can get things done. But you know, as we did touch on before, it would be interesting to see, you know, if the bill does end up being a colossal failure, it would be, you know, a good weapon for the Republicans, to be like, oh no, this is what the Democrats do. Um, you know, they don't get things done, which I guess is sort of looking at it from from interestingly from both sides. But it would legitimately be very much disappointing, if the bill, you know, if what they are, if what the bill claims to achieve, if the bill does not get passed, because you know I'm just looking at some figures, right? Just in the state of Ohio, you know, 9.7 billion will be going to roads and bridges, 1.2 billion to public transit, 253 million to airports in Ohio, which I think you know is certainly much needed for this for you know the state, which is not exactly super well developed infrastructure wise.
Hmm. And and I think it would benefit a lot of states, but as we've talked about, like there are a lot of flaws in it, and that's why I think the Democrats are trying to get this reconciliation bill done because it's way more funding, which can cover a lot of new programs, and I believe it's focused heavily on cutting carbon emissions, especially, which is one of the things that this other infrastructure bill won't do as much. So in a sense, this I at least from my perspective, I really like that plan of waiting until this reconciliation bill can be passed because it's probably going to provide some form of check back to any failures of this smaller bill because it's going to be much more prone to failure and not doing what it's supposed to because it's not a lot of money. So if you spend a lot of money to counteract that, then that might work, and it seemed that there was hope for that, but maybe there will be a strategic pause, as Joe Manchin says
Hmm.
it.
Well, actually, you did bring up the point about how this bill is also, they also want this to be, you know, one that encompasses the realm of climate change. So one of the major areas in which you know the different states in which different pieces of infrastructure are allotted funding is actually an electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And I want to talk about this because this is, I guess, interesting because you know there has never been you know a any sort of you know large federal government initiative to you know sort of promote electric vehicles in this sense. Um, so I want to know what you think about that, right? Because certainly, you know, not all of the country is too inclined um, to begin, you know, to get involved in electric vehicles. Um, so I want to know sort of, right, what do you think about that as someone who lives, you know, in West Coast California, where they're all the rage?
I think it's great. I mean, so electric vehicles have, I guess, two main problems. They're generally expensive. Uh, I guess most vehicles here are Teslas, which are a minimum, I think, $36,000. So they're not cheap. And then the much more pressing problem is the charging problem. So not only does it take longer to charge than a regular gasoline vehicle, but the range of these cars is lower, and you have the problem that there's a lot of sections of the country that you can't drive on an electric vehicle because there aren't charging stations in between. I think maybe Dallas and Denver was a good example of that.
Mm-hmm.
You probably know more about that than I do, but I think investments in electric vehicles are probably going to be great if we can at least shift the existing people driving diesel cars to electric cars. That's what I would want to see. I'd be concerned though that if we made it really easy to get an electric car, that we would then just have more and more people choose to drive, and then we're just gonna have even worse traffic, and less people taking public transit. Which, even though we may have less emissions, is still not great because we have, I guess, more um, accident potential and safety issues.
Well, I mean, another big important, as you did touch on, right? This is sort of, even though they may be better for the environment, right? Um, the bill, I guess, is sort of, in a sense, trying to change culture, if that makes sense, right? Because much of the country,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, much of the country, sort of swears by gas cars, right? Swears by, this is our American culture. It would effectively be the same thing as, saying, oh, I guess it's sort of, comparable to, for example, how many people would feel about gun control laws, where, like, they may promote safety, or they may accomplish another goal, but it would be trying to change culture of a lot of people, which I guess also ties into, whether how feasible this bill is, because if that's the case, right, like if you know if this were, used and weaponized against them, this would, I think this would, and this is a main factor that a lot of people, especially in rural America, a reason why many would be opposed to the bill. But again, as you did mention, like, Dallas to Denver, it's certainly not interstate highway, not all the way at least. So, large portions of the country, it's just not feasible, because,
Mhm, mhm.
it would, it's there just isn't there just isn't enough stuff there in place, right? Um, to warrant, electric car infrastructure. So I guess, that also raised more questions on, oh, this is another infrastructure bill. Is it, truly for all Americans, or is it only for, those in the big city? Um, but I guess one more interesting tidbit, and I guess, I have not thought much about it, is that, do you think that this is, you know this bill would be sort of indirectly promoting certain companies, namely,
Like Tesla,
yeah,
those kind of
exactly,
companies. Well,
exactly,
it's actually really interesting because from what I've read, actually the gasoline companies like Chrysler or Ford are actually really supportive of the bill because it makes it easier for them to transition to more electric cars and to get people buying their electric cars because they're supportive of the electric car industry because as long as they can produce those cars and not have the market share taken away, they're still making profits and whatnot. Like they don't need gasoline cars.
hmm
I think it's really the fossil fuel companies that would care the most because they lose their market. But like car companies can adapt, and they're very supportive of the bill because they can support adaptation. So I don't really think it's actually limiting to Tesla. Uh, it probably is going to benefit those who have existing market share now who just need the charging to
right,
be more mainstream.
hmm
But I think it's good overall for the entire automotive industry because it gives a lot more access to existing companies who have resources and I guess just general capital.
right. So the only ones to suffer are, the big gas companies.
Exactly, and there I would expect heavy opposition. Um, Although I mean the bill's already passed, so what can they do?
Well, do what they have been doing, but to House members.
Or to buy out Joe Manchin.
Buy out Joe Manchin, like double the amount of funding that they give to all House members.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, I guess that's sort of an interesting thing to think about, right? Because this is really the first, major nationwide government initiative to promote, electric 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 vehicle charging infrastructure. If the bill goes into effect, and then, let's say everything goes smoothly, like there is no colossal failure, what will life look like 10 years from now, right? Do you think, will we have, will it be drastically different? Like, will, electric cars be like the new norm, or will it be in like an interesting mix where you have, like, gas stations and electric charging stations like side by side, and then, half there's just sort of a mix of like, you can see all sorts of cars um, on the road, um, because I mean, of
Well,
course, right now, everything is still in large part gasoline dominated.
yeah, but I mean, I don't know what it's like in Ohio at least, but in California, Newsom, I believe, put in a notice that like all
Oh,
cars
that's
sold in
right.
California have to be electric. I
2035.
think, yeah, something like that. It was yeah, I believe I thought it was I was gonna say 2030, but maybe it's 2035.
Something like that.
But
Yeah.
yeah, whatever. But like I assume other states have similar policies, but also in that vein, like bus companies too have to have all electric fleets by the same day. So and I think we'll see a shift in public transit vehicles as well. But if states like what do you know if Ohio has anything vaguely similar?
Ohio has a Republican state government, so of course not. But I'm
But I mean, even without Ohio being involved, I would imagine many of the Democratic states, which I think there are more that have this policy, like that's still a lot of states with almost. I mean, you can still have gas vehicles driving from people from other states, but like cars sold in the state will have to be electric.
I mean, mm, well, as you say, actually, hold on. I found the list of states right here. So 12 states in total have some sort of initiatives. California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, Hawaii, Connecticut, New York, Oregon, North Carolina, Rhode Island, and Washington. Talk about democratic, democratic, democratic.
Well, North Carolina did vote for Trump in
But yeah,
2020,
I guess North Carolina is the exception.
but they have a Democratic governor. Some people.
Right, right. Um, so it's I it's funny. This article actually makes its way to say, quote, the states joining this ban aren't really a surprise, except for maybe one, end quote. So of course, North Carolina is the only outlier in that sense. But as you did mention, right, you know, the initiative would also require bus buses to be all electric, which I don't think would be a problem anywhere. Certainly, nobody takes it into their pride and say, "Oh, we live by gas buses," right? It's not remotely culturally significant whether your buses whether your buses are gas or electric. But it is these sorts of initiatives which I feel are just part of the increased polarization, and of course may also help to render this bill even more unpalatable to many rural Americans, in that you know you're just completely eliminating such a large part of what has been ingrained in culture, which is certainly not easy to do in certainly not easy to get over in the short run. Um, which I don't know. I just think it'd be really weird to see a lot of rural to see electric vehicles widespread in much of rural America, and for it to be even acceptable in large parts of the
Mhm.
country.
I really wish I knew more about like the car culture in these rural towns because maybe they would be accepting of electric vehicles, but I mean I can't imagine there being an adequate charging in a lot of these small towns to make it even possible. Like you would need like a charging station as common or as I guess frequent as a gas station, which is was going to take years.
Well, if you want to like an insight into what how into the values of rural voters, for example, how like a lot of states had like lotteries for getting the vaccine.
Hmm.
Well, the state of West Virginia, right, instead of giving out money, they gave out guns and pickup trucks. So that's pretty significant as to um, what people consider to be valuable, and what people consider to be their culture.
And maybe that offers more insight into Joe Manchin's positions. Maybe he'd rather spend money on giving out guns and pickup trucks.
Maybe, I mean, that would increase his support amongst a large part of his populace, if he can add guns and pickup trucks into the infrastructure bill as well.
And he does have an election coming up in 2024 if he runs again. I think he would be 77, so not very young, but who knows if he's gonna run.
Who knows what will happen, right? That is ultimately the conclusion for, as always, any one of these transit related topics. But we this is very much an ongoing topic, so everything could change. There's also, it is not impossible. It is not it is not impossible for for the government to just drop this bill entirely. Um, of course, that probably won't happen because we talked about how it would be pretty crucial for both sides of the aisle. But whether or not the effects can be realized and whether or not the 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 the, the high lofty goals can be met is something that is to be seen as well.